Greetings, YouTube friends. On August 12th, a total solar eclipse at 20 degrees Leo activates themes of leadership, sovereignty, and public authority. In this video, we'll explore the historical patterns correlated to this eclipse series, market correlations, and the central question, who has the authority to set the terms? And today I'm joined again by my friend KM to do our regular new moon video. Welcome, KM.
Thanks, Margo. Happy to be here again.
Awesome. I'm going to jump right in and screen share the upcoming solar eclipse chart, which is taking place this Wednesday over New York City. It's happening at 1:36 p.m. and it won't be visible from New York City or from anywhere here in the United States. The path of totality looks like it'll take place over Greenland, Iceland, and then it comes and hits some parts of Europe, and specifically heading over Spain and very close. The path of totality isn't exactly over the Strait of Gibraltar, but interestingly, a hotspot right now where there's a lot of activity going on. So I think one of the things that I study when I look at these eclipses is I study the path of totality, and we can look for effects that take place either leading up to, during the eclipse itself, or even up to 6 months later. And then I know that you were saying you had another way to view that is on your chart, on the maps that you're going to show us when we do astrocartography.
Yeah, let's definitely look at the maps because, for instance, it's really interesting how there's a horizontal latitude line that goes straight through the area where there's been an immigration crisis for Spain. Yeah. And then next year in the second Leo eclipse, we only have 2 in this cycle. There is the path of totality goes over the Strait of Gibraltar. So there's just so much activation for the Iberian Peninsula and the entire region of Western Europe as a result. And what I think is so interesting about this eclipse is it's the first Leo eclipse followed by the last Pisces eclipse. So if we can expect big changes in leadership, perhaps some leaders stepping down or being removed because it's a south node, even if it's not about removal, there's going to be a change in leadership and in question about, just like you said, who is in charge. And I think what's really interesting about it being followed up by a Pisces one in conjunct is that it's about the collective digesting that change and the collective consciousness of Pisces saying, okay, well, where do we go from here? And there could be a little bit of unraveling, where we can talk about that eclipse. It's square Uranus, it's unpredictable. And Pisces is not about details. This has been a year and a half about losing the details. And it will be really interesting to see how that plays out because there's only a few in history that we have this Leo to Pisces back to back. I don't know if it'd be interesting to go through them real quickly and see a pattern.
Oh, yeah. I think it would be interesting to go through them. When I wrote my monthly newsletter for August, I felt like the themes were weaving together, of course, because they're related, but from the Leo eclipse, which I kind of gave the theme to who has the authority to set the terms. And then the lunar eclipse, the theme that kept coming up for me is what happens when those terms meet reality. So that's kind of a very, the Pisces Virgo axis is the axis of, details and reality
versus dreams.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And I think since the South Node has now left Virgo, some of that Virgo detail is back in the collective consciousness, and the North Node has left Pisces. So it's interesting that the final Pisces one happens after the nodes have shifted. But yeah, so, you can look back and see, the handoff between these over time. And it's not always the South Node to the North Node, but the last time we had the South Node in Leo was not the last time we had the South Node in Leo. The last time we had an eclipse in Leo followed by one in Pisces was 1998. And okay. I find that really interesting because that was at the top of the .com boom, not the total top, but towards the end of it, right?
Yeah, that is interesting.
And we didn't actually have one when the South Node was in Leo last, which was 2008, 2009. We didn't have a handoff like we have here. And the time before 1998 was all the way back in 1980. which was another really important time where we looked at the leadership changes. In the US, this was a big time, right? This was the transition from a series of Democratic presidents, Democratic Congress. It was one term for Carter, and he lost. Even though this eclipse happened in August 1980, it was before the election, before Reagan had won, but it was a transition of power. And what was happening then, that was in the middle of the Iran hostage crisis. That was a big part of the reason historians believe Carter lost that election. So you can always see these transitions in leadership. I mean, that was one of the biggest political transitions in US history. And 1998 was too, in a way, on top of the economic changes.
That's very interesting. 1980 was also, when you said that, what it made me think of is it was the peak in the silver market at the time.
Right,
And
right,
one of the other themes that I saw coming up when I was looking at the Saros series and the Metonic series of both eclipses was events correlated to the precious metals market. Uh,
right.
and so that, I guess it's interesting how we see not only similar countries, we see Iran involved again, right? And then also in the Saros series of the solar eclipse that takes place on Wednesday, the one in Leo, we had one of those in 1990, just 11 days before the invasion of Kuwait as well, which
Wow.
kind of brings the same region into the picture, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Fascinating. And I think that what is really interesting for me with the metals, you've done a lot of research that it's not as simple as South Node bad, metals down, right? A lot of people think astrology can be that simple, or financial astrology, but that there is some reckoning. I mean, gold and Leo have a really important connection. And even if silver doesn't have as much of a connection to Leo, the metals are very much tied together. And it's fascinating that 1980 was the final, or the one of those handoffs between Leo and Pisces.
Yeah, that is very interesting that aligns there. Was there another one before 1980 you had tracked?
Yeah, and you can go back in time with those, but those were the most recent ones. And then there was one in the 70s. Let me pull up the exact date here. That it was in the early 70s. It was right 1971, February 1971. So we had the first Leo eclipse in that series with the last Pisces eclipse. And that was obviously a big change. That was after Lyndon B. Johnson had stepped down and agreed not to run for office again. And it was in the middle of Nixon's first term. That was actually when, in the middle of Nixon's term, there was a big midterm election, which we're now engaged with it once again. So there's that connection as well.
Ah, yes, that is the midterm election year connection as well. One of the other connections that I found correlated to the Leo eclipse is a correlation. I went back and looked at all of the different Leo eclipses in the Saros series, and they're not all going to be in the sign of Leo. So there's different ways of looking at the eclipses, right? The Saros series is a way of tracking actually when the next eclipse will be in the sky, and it tracks roughly every 18.6 years, and they come in families. And the eclipse family of Saros series 126 is this current eclipse that's going to take place on Wednesday, this total solar eclipse. And that one has a strong correlation to borders, corridors, and sovereignty.
Right.
And things that just show up over and over again. And so, the 1990 eclipse was involved with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. We also had the Russo-Gregorian Wars. And in 2008, we also had that eclipse took place 45 days before the collapse of the Lehman Brothers. So
Right.
the number one thing that eclipse family is correlated to is a recession taking place within a 2-month boundary of that eclipse series. And it was a very high percentage. I believe it was, let me pull up. I've got actually these workbooks that I've been doing that I can share.
I mean, that's an incredible statistic because even though we have been in sort of like a secular recession since COVID, you can argue that I know your friend Jared says we've been in a rolling recession because there's different areas that have taken a break and there's inflation and all of that. it doesn't feel like a recession is imminent. It feels like the market is top heavy. It feels like things are chaotic. Feels like everything, inflation is still a big problem, but it doesn't feel like 2008 when there had already been so much unraveling of the markets that people knew a recession was imminent. And so that statistic you have is fascinating to me.
It is. And you know what it is it's that 8 out of 12 total eclipses. And I
Wow.
actually reviewed eclipses back to 1828.
Wow.
So I actually went back pretty far. And so, you know, that's 75% probability, you know, a correlation. And I thought that one of the things I thought that was really interesting about it too is because the nodes just transited into the Aquarius Leo axis, which makes sense since we're having a Leo eclipse, because it's a south nodal eclipse, right? But the nodes transiting the Aquarius Leo axis have a correlation to lows in the business cycle. That was first identified by Louise McWhirter. And so it made sense to me when we suddenly see this from a different angle. When we're just looking at the Saros series of eclipses, it emerges again. Pretty fascinating.
Absolutely, yeah. And it'll be interesting to see what the leadership change is, what the authority change is in the coming weeks. That is a seed for what's happening. I think you could argue that the one in 2027, the second Leo eclipse, is perhaps bigger or brings things to a culmination. It's in the middle of three eclipses, which is somewhat unusual. And yet, something important could definitely be seeded in the next couple of weeks that we want to track and notice. I think it's really interesting going back to, how you have the Metonic cycle and the Saros cycle for the lunar cycle. We're going to have a full moon in Leo next winter that won't be an eclipse. So you will be able to notice the story continuing, even though it's not an eclipse. And you might even be able to work with this energy a little bit more. I know a lot of astrologers say this is too chaotic or unusual or unpredictable to work with a new moon and start something when it's in an eclipse. But I
Mm.
do think that the fact that the full moon of this Leo eclipse isn't an eclipse itself will be really revealing. And it's in the middle of an important Mars retrograde in Leo and Virgo. It's going to be happening around two other eclipses. So I really want us to track what begins now.
Yeah, I think that that is really important. It's because I mean it's the first eclipse then in this next series as we move through the signs of Leo and Aquarius. So um I am curious to see what is going to emerge out of that. And I think one of the things that I think of that's coming up is I think about the sovereignty disputes up in Greenland. And
Mm.
you know, who controls Greenland, right? Who controls the resources in Greenland, because ultimately that's what the battle is about, right? But I noticed that that was coming back to the front lines again or it was being talked about in the news media again. And I've been expecting that we would start to see Greenland surface again as a topic as we approach this eclipse.
Yeah, and you remember that full moon in Cancer where the US did that military action in Venezuela? There was a line that went straight through Greenland as well, and Greenland was in the news there. And so it's
Yep.
consistently been activated by astrocartography this year. And not only are there astrocartography lines, which are the four angles, but the actual path of totality goes through Greenland. So we'll want to watch that.
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead and show the astrocartography maps?
Yeah, I
We're
can definitely do
we're talking
that.
about it. It seems like a
Let's
good.
just jump right into it.
Yep.
I have to share my screen. Okay, can you see the map?
Yep.
Okay, so this is for the first eclipse in on August 12th, this Wednesday. And you can see what's really interesting to me is that this doesn't show the path of totality. I'll show that in a second. But look at the Venus line and Neptune line straight through there, as well as Saturn. So all over Greenland, you have Chiron, which is like perhaps the ever bleeding wound of not having sovereignty. Venus could
Mm.
actually be resources and money that are available there, but then illusion, deception.
Mm.
I don't think they have oil, do they?
Think so. That's not
Um,
something I've heard. Um,
yeah, but sometimes when I see Neptune lines, that's what makes me ask that. I am really curious about the fact that not only does the path of totality, so you can see here that the path of totality is between these dotted lines that say 1.0 on either side.
mhm.
And So
Okay.
it actually, Reykjavik gets the path of totality, even if a lot of Iceland is slightly out of it. But then
Wow.
you have this Uranus line crossing a Chiron line over Iceland. I think they're going to have issues of, if not sovereignty, leadership, and resources, and their role in international relations. But the Saturn line through Greenland is probably the more difficult one. That is the IC line, which is all about not only home, family, foundations, roots, but for a country can literally be the resources in the land. Can you believe that? Like the things that
Yeah,
are in the earth.
that makes perfect sense. Do you know what? I just actually looked it up, and just to correct us, Greenland actually holds substantial estimated oil and natural gas deposits. It says the US Geological Survey estimates that areas like Northeast Greenland could contain over 30 billion barrels of oil.
Wow.
So that's really fascinating that we have Neptune and Venus go right there. Um,
Y- Yeah.
that's
And the reason those lines are there is that Venus opposes Neptune the same day as the eclipse. So that illusory nature of Neptune is baked into the eclipse. And I think it's fascinating that the lines for that opposition go through Greenland.
Yeah, that is really quite brilliant. And that opposition taking place also at 4 degrees with activates the Barbeau basket still, because a lot of the outer planets are still sitting at 4 degrees. I noticed that the lunar eclipse is also that takes place at 4 degrees Pisces, which is
I
also
know.
activating that grid architecture from the
You,
basket.
you can't make it up.
You cannot. You really cannot.
Yeah, so here's the line down here that I wanted to show. I've turned off a lot of the horizontal lines, the latitude lines, because they can be a little bit distracting. But if I show all of them, look at this. There is a small Spanish enclave actually in North Africa near Morocco called Ceuta. And
Mm-hmm.
you have the Sun Uranus horizontal latitude line, which means this is where two lines intersect at an exact latitude, and that latitude throughout the world is activated. And for it to be this close, and we were seeing events last week and the week before in this enclave that is owned by Spain related to their immigration policy, which is a reflection of Europe's immigration policy, that to me showed the power of astrocartography. And if we go back to the bigger lines, which have a bigger influence, those horizontal latitude lines only have about 30 to 50 miles of influence. So when they're that close, it's fascinating to me. But we can see that, again, the path of totality goes through all of Basque country and down to Valencia. Barcelona's just outside of it. It's going to be really emphasizing Spain's role in the world, in Western Europe. We talked about this in a prior new moon video, but they've been a really strong advocate of peace and a strong advocate against the war on Iran, where other countries in Europe have gone along with the US. And then I thought this line up here, I mean, not to be too European centric, but to have a Mars line on this eclipse about leadership and sovereignty straight through connecting Ireland, an island nation that has always struggled with sovereignty over the United Kingdom, continuing into Scotland, which also has its own sovereignty issues. It's fascinating.
It's fascinating. And you know what else I just thought of when we were talking about Spain is Spain won the World Cup this year.
Oh, right.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
So just in the top
Yeah.
in the realm of leadership, right?
Yeah.
And in a different realm, but yeah, being seen, because Leo is about being seen, right? Um, and
That's brilliant.
it's also 20 degrees Leo is just the very beginning of the third decan of Leo, which is ruled by Mars, right? And Mars is, the warrior, but Mars can also be is commonly seen in sports and athletics as well.
Yeah. And that's what makes me think that Mars line's important because of the Decan that you pointed out.
Mm-hmm.
We can see over here, I can zoom in a bit, but the actual astrocartography lines. So when we see the sun and moon lines, which are these brown lines here going through Romania and pretty close to Moscow, Belarus, Western Ukraine, these are descendant lines. So this is where the eclipse is going to land exactly on the descendant of these areas, activating partnerships, neighbors, open
Hmm.
enemies, all those themes of the seventh house. And for it to be connecting Western Ukraine, I mean, it's very close to Kiev, to Western Russia. I think is likely that something about that war is going to be in the news in the next couple weeks. We also have a north node line going straight through Kiev. And I always look at the nodal lines on an eclipse, even if, this is, the node is later in Leo and this eclipse is at 20 degrees. It's still important because of the influence of them. And then last but not least, in this region, surprise, surprise, we have a Saturn line going straight through the Strait of Hormuz, which makes me think,
Yeah.
even if there's an announcement about it being opened or there's a peace deal, I think something about this eclipse, at least in the short term, is going to be about it remaining closed because you have Saturn there.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like the restriction will continue. And I also was looking at the eclipse and in its relationship to the part of fortune. Um,
You want to share, or do you want
oh
me to
yeah,
pull up
sure.
that?
Do you have the part of fortune
I
on?
do, yeah. I just deactivate it for the maps because it's specific to New York, but yeah,
Got
you
it.
can see it here in the first house. I'll change to equal sign real quick.
Yeah.
Well, it's always going to be on the
It's
ascendant
always
in the
going to
new
be on the
moon,
ascendant, right?
but the fact that it's in Scorpio is really interesting. The fact that it's Scorpio rising. And I don't know, did we talk about the New York chart yet? I think
We
it's
did no, we didn't yet, but it's also square to the new moon because even though it's on the ascendant, it's going to make different aspects all the time uh
right.
to the different various new moons, right? And the fact that it's square on the ascendant over New York City just doesn't seem very favorable to me. Generally speaking, because we track the part of fortune over New York City. And it is usually a pretty good barometer base to use the angles of the new moons and the full moons and what they make to the part of fortune.
Yeah, definitely. That's always a great technique I like you developed. And then the chart ruler, or at least the classical chart ruler, Mars, is in its fall in the eighth house. And that to me, you know, I don't think that's good, and then you have Uranus in the seventh house. I think there could be some really disruptive moments. And I know we're expecting volatility. Eclipse seasons are always volatile, but that's really interesting to me.
I agree. And, Mars in Cancer also is very protective. It makes me think of defense of the homeland. Uh,
Hmm.
so that's certainly something at play. And I've actually been keeping an eye on defense stocks. I was looking at XAR, the ETF, actually just today. But yeah, that is, you know, I think that overall and statistically, when I back tested all of the eclipses in this series, they're not overwhelmingly negative, believe it or not. Like I tested them at 1 month, at 3 months, and at 12 months for is the market positive or negative? And 1 month after the eclipse, the market was usually in the Saros series, the market was typically positive, actually. So I don't think it looks too devastating at this moment, but I guess we have to just see how it unfolds 1 week to the next.
And that's the same cycle that also has a high probability of a recession. So
Yeah.
it's like it just goes to show how the recession can be so different from the market behavior. If you have those patterns for the market behavior, volatile but ultimately positive, and yet a recession 2 months later, that could be the reality that there's just too much inflation to keep this economy strong, even if the markets are doing well.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. I just found the statistic. What I found on the just looking at Dow Jones market returns at 1 month, the 50% of the eclipses saw price positive after 1 month, but almost 80% of them in the Metonic series saw positive markets after 1 month. And then as you went out 3 months, it kind of it starts coming down a little bit. And it's just very interesting that the Metonic series, which is the 19-year series, which is the series that I have actually found to be most correlated to price action
Right.
in the financial markets, is the Metonic series. And if anybody is new to my channel, I actually did several videos on the Metonic cycle and how I create analogs correlated to the Metonic cycle They're a couple years old, so they're on old price action, but they're interesting videos, and I'll put a link in the video description below. But the Metonic cycle has only about a 37.5% probability of the markets being positive 12 months later. Isn't that interesting? That's pretty low.
Wow. Even though the short term is positive, that's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, the short term on the Metonic, it's actually 87.5%. I found where I can hover over and get the exact rate. And then it just kind of slowly, then at 3 months, it's 75% positive. At 6 months, it's 50% positive. And then at 12 months, it's 37.5% positive. So it seems kind of like a slow and steady decline, which is actually very interesting because this is kind of tangential to the eclipses, but we also are going to have the first Jupiter Saturn trine take place at the end of this month. And the correlation that I found with that when I ran back testing was to transitional periods in the market. So it wasn't like you get a Jupiter Saturn trine and everything's great and off to the races like some people might think. And it also wasn't like you get a Jupiter Saturn trine and it's the end of the world. It was more like the Jupiter Saturn trine marks this period of several months where the market regime actually shifts to something different.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, it's going to be a really interesting couple months. I like how you talk about that slow and steady decline because I think so many people in the astrology community, not Finastro, are feeling the intensity and the unprecedented nature of this astrology and expecting some sort of crash or dramatic event. And one of the things I've been saying just from a mundane perspective is we have too much big astrology for years for there to be one single event. And it's not just this, we had Barbo's basket, and now we're going to have a Venus retrograde, and then we're having the changing in human design next winter along with Mars retrograde. But I wanted to finish a couple things on the map. So not only look at that Venus Neptune line, oil, money, resources over the Middle East to Saudi Arabia, just absolutely incredible. But you can see this Mars line going from pretty close to Beijing. Again, these diagonal lines have up to 700-mile influence, but definitely 300. And we're talking under 300 here, all the way down to off the coast of Taipei. So I keep having my eye on that. I know you and I are going to do a video someday about the winter eclipses and the connection to Taiwan, but that still stuck out for me for this eclipse. And in the US, we can see that the eclipse is on the MC line, which means this is going to be very public. This is going to be very prominent. And so even though the eclipse is not visible, although you can see here, look, it's 0.6, 0.4% visible, but it won't be a totality in the North America sky. But look at that, straight through Florida, the South, into the Midwest, Ohio, Detroit,
It's hitting Cuba too.
and Cuba, really close to Havana. And there's that crossover between the part of Fortune and Cuba, which isn't unusual in a new moon because, again, it's calculated based on the moon, the rising, and the sun.
Yeah.
But the fact that they're intersecting on the eclipse isn't always here or the new moon isn't always here. And there is once again that Jupiter Hygeia conjunction you've been talking about going through southern Mexico into cutting the country in half, basically through Louisiana, hovering through the Mississippi River. I thought that was something interesting you'd find.
Interesting. And look how Chiron also crosses it up there in Minnesota.
Yeah. Yeah, Minnesota is often activated. And so I'm wondering if something's going to return there having to do with anything. That was where Black Lives Matter began in 2020. That's where the ICE protests began in January. And then this is kind of niche, but in LA, you have the Saturn line going there through the IC, through the roots of the city. And what happened there when Mars retrograded in Cancer were the devastating fires of January 2025. So Mars moves back into Cancer one day before this eclipse. And I wonder if not something returning, but just a reflection on how much the city's recovered even, or how much has changed since those fires, what the leadership change represents. They still have the same mayor, but is there a change of leadership or a change of who's in charge because of those fires? And that was something I meant to mention earlier, is Mars moving into a water sign right before this Leo fiery eclipse is an unusual aspect I don't think enough people are talking about, because every other planet is going to be in a fire or air sign. Mercury's now in Leo. Venus is in Libra. All the outer planets are in fire and air signs. The sun and moon are in a fire sign. How can we understand that hot, fiery summer in the context of the hottest planet being in a water sign?
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting. It makes me think of humidity.
Yeah, and I mean, where I live is incredibly unnaturally or uncustomarily humid. We have two hurricanes on the way that land on the day of the eclipse, which you can't make up. Hopefully, they dissipate or go a different direction. But this is, in my mind, like hurricane or summer weather for the northern hemisphere, where you could have some really sudden or like a deluge of rain out of the blue, especially as Mars gets closer to Saturn, to a square with Saturn at the end of the month. But for this moon, just think about the fact that Mars is an important planet. It rules the decan the moon's happening in, the eclipse is happening in, and it's the only planet not in a fire air sign.
That's really interesting. And, that makes me want to look at where, let's see, it's sitting in the eighth house. That's right. We talked about that over New York City. Hmm.
Yeah,
It's also forming a sextile to the midheaven over New York City at that moment too, which is
right.
interesting because a sextile and that looks like it's a waning sextile. So that would imply some sort of push or energy towards the closing of a
Yeah,
cycle, you know?
yeah, definitely. So worth looking into where in your life, where in your chart you have Mars and in Cancer, and how that could be having a relation to this story. I like that you pointed out the midheaven because technically by sign, Cancer is in conjunct Leo, but yeah, in New York, it's sextiling it pretty close.
Yeah, it is. It's very interesting. And here, actually, let me share my chart
Yeah,
real quick, just because I like to be able to click on the different planets to show what aspects they're making. It's just kind of handy for visual. Um, so that would be the Mars, and then who's the ruler of Mars, right? The ruler of Mars is the moon, and so where is the moon? The moon is conjunct the sun in Leo. So that's really interesting. Um, that's super interesting. We've got Mars as the ruler of the ascendant, and then we've got the moon, the eclipsed, or the moon, the new moon, sorry, as the ruler of Mars. That's an interesting cycle that we have
yeah,
going on.
it's a very like interwoven matrix. Everything's related, everything's connected, but
Yeah.
um, I think it's really important to notice, and especially, I mean, just in the weather of what's happening. But the thing about Mars in Cancer, it's in its fall, and anytime a planet is in its fall, there's a trap
Mm.
that takes the planet's natural instincts and sometimes misdirects them or just has them fall into this trap. And for Mars, a direct, action-oriented planet, a fast planet, it can be overreactive. It can use that sensitive nature of Cancer and the moon being Cancer's ruler, and it can overreact. Not that Mars in Cancer is bad if you have that in your natal chart, but it's something to be aware of when we're dealing with this transit that is having an impact on the eclipse, even though it's out of sign. How are you avoiding being overreactive? And maybe I'm just speaking to myself here, but I
No,
think that's
I
an
think
important
that's
lesson.
I think that's great. And actually, I have Mars in Cancer.
I know, I know, I
Um,
know. That's why I'm saying it's
so
not a
so
bad
I
natal.
can I can totally speak a little bit to it because I think one of the other important ways in which like Mars being in its fall and Cancer shows up is it can be being indecisive also.
Hmm.
Just like talking about all of the myriad of ways of that it could show up, right? One of the other things though that I notice about Mars and Cancer, and not just from my own chart, but from I've seen lots of charts of people with Mars and Cancer, as I'm sure you have as well. Um, I find that a lot of people with Mars and Cancer tend to have a tepid anger. Like they don't tend to be as reactive as, say, like a Mars and Scorpio, for example, right? A Mars and Scorpio tends to be have a quick to flare anger. And what I notice with a Mars in Cancer, and we're kind of just drifting off into personal astrology here, but is a little bit more sensitivity and almost internalization of anger or
Hmm.
frustration,
Hmm. That's
So
beautiful. Yeah.
that could be a thing to be aware of if you're a person who has Mars in Cancer or your chart's getting activated by this, just to make sure that you are tuned into how you're processing your emotions and not overly internalizing them.
Well, and it's not just a side tangent because guess who has Mars in Cancer? The richest man in the world who owns a lot of SpaceX and Tesla, important stocks that we study, important stocks that impact the indices. And we saw him have such a huge public display. You know, he was so public during the Mars retrograde in Cancer, and this is a return for him. So, how does this impact his public standing? Not to make this all about one person, but it is a Leo eclipse that is singular and focused on people who are leaders in our world right now. And like him or not, he is a leader. So, this will be interesting to see how that impacts him.
You
I know
talking
he's a
about
Cancer rising too. Elon Musk. Did I not
Elon
say
Musk?
Elon?
That's what I thought.
Yeah,
I was just,
sorry.
yeah, no, I thought that's who you were talking about. I was going to say I could pull up his chart real quick because
Yeah, pull it up.
yeah, let's see, hold on. I got to rearrange these
I
little
didn't mean to
windows.
speak in code,
No,
but yeah,
I thought that's who you were talking about, but I was like, okay, I'm going to make a guess and I think I'm right. But just in case, I'm going to ask. Yeah, I've looked at Elon Musk's chart quite a bit. I compared his chart to Nikola Tesla's chart once. That was actually a
right,
fascinating rabbit
right.
hole that I went down. But here is his chart. And oh, wait, is this is Elon Musk. He doesn't have Mars in Cancer. He has Mars at 20 degrees Aquarius, unless this is the wrong chart.
No, you know what? I was mixing up his Cancer rising
Oh
with
yeah,
Mars,
look
and
at
yeah,
him. Oh yeah,
and
he's got Sirius on rising. I mean,
yeah,
that Sirius is
yeah.
it's the brightest star in the sky, right? So that is that makes sense. He is a leader, right? He shines.
Yeah, and actually, he's not necessarily someone who internalizes emotions like you were saying with Mars and Cancer, but you can see how activating Mars and Cancer can be when it moves through a part of your chart, and not in a bad way. I mean, he had
Yeah,
an incredibly successful winter, even while it was retrograding in its fall. So it's something to take note of.
makes me want to look at Tesla. I know
Yeah, I think it could be worthwhile.
SpaceX just found a bottom. Let's just for curiosity's sake take a quick peek.
Yeah, I could see this being really activating for his companies in a good way.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, that was a major breakdown. I remember. So I've done some pretty deep dive work on the Tesla chart, and actually it has Tesla itself has a natal Jupiter Uranus conjunction. And
Cool.
so the Jupiter Uranus cycle actually really moves Tesla. And look here, I love going back and looking at these cycles. So this was the geocentric Jupiter Uranus direct septile right there on 527 before this major move down happened. And that definitely, each one of these aspects has a tendency to have a correlation within a couple of weeks of a major pivot. So interestingly, yeah, here we are coming down into the 20-week cycle low. And that just formed a bearish 20-week cycle at the very end. Look at that. It just broke that support coming down
Incredible.
into the low there. So that's pretty interesting. It's curious to see how this eclipse hits the Tesla chart. Makes me want to check Tesla. Never know what kind of rabbit holes we're going to end up down in one of these conversations.
No, it's really interesting to see the impact for someone who's a founder. It's not even necessarily in their chart, and how it will impact the actual asset or the stock.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a great trick that I think is very useful, actually. Particularly if a founder or, executive director is having negative transits, it's really good to know that if you're, holding a stock for a long term.
Yeah.
So look at this. That's interesting. The eclipse is going to take place in the 12th house. Over the Tesla natal chart, but also this is a 9:30 a.m. chart too, which is the first day to trade that I use. So it might not be the exact moment that Tesla went live, but it is the first day that it traded.
Fascinating.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. The other thing I thought we could talk about before we are all done for the day is the lunar eclipse that's taking place, and we did briefly touch on this, but not that one. This one. Here we go. The lunar eclipse that's taking place on August 28th. And we did talk briefly about it. We didn't look at the chart yet, though. At 4 degrees of Pisces is definitely activating the Barbeau basket grid architecture again. And this one really jumps out at me because it's coming right off of the Mercury Cazimi. And so you have Mercury tightly orbed to the sun, and Mercury's the ruler of the sun in this case. And so sitting opposite to the eclipse, it's, it makes me think, what is it that is going to be concealed and revealed? Because that's one of the big things I think of when I think of thematics for any eclipse. I look at what sign is it in, what house is it in, whose chart is it on that I'm looking at, and what is it that we don't know that will be revealed to us. And even a little bit on a tangent of that, I posted a quote in my Discord today from actually Bill Meridian's book, The Predictive Power of Eclipses. And it was just, he was studying Charles Jane's work on eclipses. And he says, try to avoid making a really big decision for up to 7 to 10 days before an eclipse, because leading up to the eclipse, there is something that we aren't aware of or that we can't see. And so the nodes, being the fated axis, bring into your life, each individual lives or the collective reality, a fated component of uncertainty that is above and beyond what we would normally be dealing with. And so I always think about that in the financial markets too. And I try not to initiate too many new positions during that time either, because I think that there is something that we will learn about ourselves or about our collective reality that we're not currently seeing.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting one because, it is the final in a series. And even if it's a North Node eclipse, they can feel like one of growth or hunger for something more. Pisces is a sign about letting go. It's the final sign. It can be about loss. It can be about transitioning things away. So in some ways, you have two transitionary eclipses back to back. I know this is a little bit of a stretch, but you have Leo South Node is about letting go of some story, some expression with that Leo heart-centric, expressive leadership energy. And then you're ending a Pisces cycle. And not only is this the final Pisces eclipse, but we have ended decades of Pisces energy. I wrote a big piece on this, how ever since the early 90s when Saturn went into Pisces, we've either had an outer planet or the nodes in Pisces since then, over 30 years, almost 40 years. There was like an 8-month gap here or there, but it was Saturn, and then you had Uranus, and then you had Neptune, you had Jupiter in between those a few times. And we're going to go through a stretch now where we don't have anything in Pisces except for the usual Pisces season where the inner planets and the sun move through Pisces. And I think that is going to be such a big shift away from our era of fake news and surreality and strangeness, or feeling like we're in a simulation. So how is that ending around this eclipse? How are you letting that feeling go? Or how has your life changed in this important period? I don't know if you agree, but I see this eclipse as like a capstone on more than just 18 months or 2 years, because the first Pisces eclipse was September 2024. I see this as the end of decades of Pisces influence in some
Wow,
ways.
I hadn't actually thought about it in that context, and I think that's brilliant, actually. I love the idea of it being a capstone, and it's really quite perfect because it is activating the outer planetary alignments from the Barbeau basket, because all of
Right?
the outer planets are still sitting very close to where they were during that alignment, right? We've
Yeah.
and the other thing that we have to acknowledge is that Uranus is it's a T square, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and so that's going to bring some like unexpected news or some unexpected in Uranus and Gemini, right? Unexpected communication. It's in the 12th house over New York City. So again, it's like this theme of what are we not seeing, or of something being revealed, because the 12th house is hidden matters as well. And then you've got that Uranus Pluto trine also that gets activated there. So the other thing that really stands out to me when I did this research on the historical patterns correlated to this was that there is a strong correlation to events pertaining to gold and silver, and specifically the way it hits the COMEX chart actually stood out to me. So if this is now here, we've got the COMEX chart, and this is the COMEX founding. So there's a couple different COMEX dates you could use, but this is the COMEX founding chart. And it is a 12 p.m. chart because we don't know the exact time on February 23rd of 1933 that it was founded. But if we take a look at where it falls, it's falling right here on the nodal axis, within orb of the nodal axis, and then the moon itself is exactly conjunct the sun, and
Incredible.
the sun in Pisces. And so it makes me think of what you were talking about, though, about a capstone or an ending of a cycle. And it makes me curious what kind of, I don't know if we're going to see new leadership in the context of the Leo eclipse, because we definitely saw the correlation to the gold and silver cycle there as well, or if we're going to see the ending of some other cycle or of COMEX's leadership, because, you know, we saw the desk for JP Morgan moved over to Beijing. And, you know, there's been a lot of precious metals activity over in China. So I just think I'm hypothesizing on things that we could see manifest out of this, you know. We could also,
No,
yeah, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, I think it's almost hard to hypothesize because our system feels so real and grounded and unchangeable. But we're going through cycles that could be very similar to 1980, 1970s when Nixon, remember I said that one Leo to Pisces was during Nixon's midterm, and it wasn't exactly when Nixon cut the US dollar off of the gold standard completely, but that was an important event that happened afterward. I think that, what did that happen in 74, 76?
I have to check.
And
I have it. I think I have the
you
chart.
have that chart somewhere. But
Yes.
my point is broader, is that I think you're totally right to look for that with, China leaning
Oh
more
my
and
gosh,
more.
it was 71.
Oh, was it
It
actually
was
71?
71.
Okay. So it
Yeah.
was right after this cycle. So there
Wow.
you go.
Oh my gosh. I'm so glad we were having this conversation. Look at this. Holy cow. It was on August 15th, 1971. This was the
No
Nixon.
way.
Yeah.
That was in the middle of the two eclipses.
Wow.
So,
And I hadn't even picked up, I had picked up some other events that were correlated. The like the this sorry. Yes, this Metonic series was also correlated to the Specie Circular from 1836 and the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1893. And then there was a sterling crisis also shortly before Britain left the gold standard in 1931. So
wow.
this, and then now we've got this 1971 connection too. So it really makes me think that there's going to be some sort of correlation to the gold and silver markets. And I mean, just on a most base level of like technical analysis, we're, putting in a 20-week cycle low right now. And we had a pretty major pivot back in January that was also correlated to that 1980 cycle, right? So there's a lot of cycles that are merging here, which is, I love it when that comes together like that.
And you know what I think could play out in the US? I mean, I'm not surprised if there will be some news related to gold, but I think we could see the Clarity Act fail or pass around this eclipse. And that is the next step for currency changes in the US. We did that video on it. And I think that is something we should keep in close focus because it is part of the story that began in 1971 with Nixon removing us from the gold standard completely.
Yeah, that's a huge event that is correlated to this. And with regard to the Clarity Act, there's a vote that's due in early September on the Clarity Act. Let me see what date that is.
Yeah, it's right around the Mars square Saturn. And so that will be really interesting to see if it struggles to pass because of the limiting impact of that nature or of that aspect. But that's incredible. I don't know why I was thinking that Nixon act was later because obviously he was not in office by 76. But I think that we should really think about where gold is changing its role over the coming weeks. Not even just the months and years, but the coming weeks.
Yeah, I agree. Kind of to your point about the Clarity Act, like the questions that come to my mind when I think about this is what qualifies as money, right?
Yeah.
Or who controls the money supply, right?
Right,
And
which is a leadership thing.
yeah, exactly. That's a total leadership thing. So it's that interplay with, and the other thing that, I will note is that even though, hold on, this is the Nixon shock. Let's go back to this eclipse. This is our lunar eclipse. Even though the eclipse is at 4 degrees of Pisces, you know, the nodes are still in the Leo Aquarius axis. So, an eclipse can take place. I think it's up to like 10 degrees, I think, from the nodes, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's just interesting that it weaves through that the Leo Aquarius energy through the nodes, through the fated axis, if you will, into, the moon and the sun and what's illuminated there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we are in for, I feel like it's just always fascinating to watch how these events unfold because we get a really good idea of the historical connections and the themes and the energetics behind something. Um, and then it's really just so interesting to watch it all play out.
Yeah, I love the rabbit holes that you and I go down. This was a really cool realization about gold, huh?
Yeah, it definitely was. Um,
Well,
awesome.
I will just say I'm telling everyone whatever leaves you this week, let it go. And I think that can be
Mhm.
hard with Leo because it's very personal, it's very bold, it's very expressive, and it's always uncomfortable, especially in our capitalist society, to let things go, to lose, to downgrade. But I think as the start of a cycle and the future connections this eclipse has to the Mars retrograde, to the three eclipses next summer, to Jupiter, we really can launch forward by letting go. I actually think it could be a really beneficial eclipse if you work with it in that way.
I think that's really beautiful. And it pulls through the Pisces energy as well, of the letting go concept. So
You know us, we're relentless optimists, right?
yeah.
Even as we let go.
Well, letting go is probably one of the core foundations of my own like personal practice. So I love that interpretation. Thank you for weaving that together.
You're
Um,
welcome. Thanks for
awesome.
having me.
Yeah, do you want to tell the viewers where they can find you?
Yes, I've been doing a lot of work on Substack and Patreon. The Weekly Stars is my handle. We'd love to have you join me there.
Awesome. And everybody, you can find me at my Patreon or my Discord. Links will be in the video description below, or you can follow me on Twitter, or right here on YouTube. And don't forget to like and subscribe my video. You can even turn on the bell notifications so you don't miss the next one. See ya.